Good evening, ladies, and anyone else who has wandered in. First, we are starting the novella Carmilla tonight. The lectures I can do quite well, but this story was written in 1872, so the language and writing style are a bit antiquated, and reading it live was just too challenging for me because of my aphasia issue. So, even though I have gotten negative comments on the use of AI voices in previous videos, alas, this is the only way we will get through this. Over the last several episodes, we have explored topics such as attraction, meaning, identity, fantasy, and the human need for connection. What makes Carmilla so fascinating is that it takes those same themes and presents them through story rather than lecture. As we move through the novel, we will see how Gothic literature examines many of the same questions that continue to shape human psychology today. Today I have something a little different, images inspired by the novel to set the mood and help you get into the story. Beneath its haunted castles, forgotten ruins, and supernatural mysteries lies a deeply human story about loneliness, attraction, longing, and the search for something that seems missing from our lives. Before Dracula, before the modern vampire, before the legends became familiar, there was Carmilla, one of the first Gothic vampire novels that dealt with human condition through the psychology of monsters, longing, desire, and vampiric attraction. In 1872, Irish writer Sheridan Le Fanu introduced the world to one of the most influential and unsettling figures in Gothic literature, Carmilla. Beautiful, mysterious, seductive, and terrifying, Carmilla helped establish many of the vampire themes that would later become staples of the genre. Yet beneath supernatural horror lies something deeper about desire, loneliness, identity, obsession, and the dangerous attraction of the unknown. Over the coming episodes, we'll explore this groundbreaking Gothic novella chapter by chapter, examining not only the story itself, but also the psychology, symbolism, cultural anxieties, and enduring themes that have kept Carmilla alive for more than 150 years. If you've ever been fascinated by vampires, outsiders, forbidden desires, hidden identities, or the darker corners of human nature, this journey begins here. Welcome to Carmilla. Chapter 1. An early fright in Styria. We, though by no means magnificent people, inhabit a castle or schloss. A small income in that part of the world goes a great way. 800 or 900 a year does wonders. Scantily enough, ours would have answered among wealthy people at home. My father is English, and I bear an English name, although I never saw England. But here, in this lonely and primitive place, where everything is so marvelously cheap, I really don't see how ever so much more money would at all materially add to our comforts or even luxuries. My father was in the Austrian service and retired upon a pension and his patrimony and purchased this feudal residence and the small estate on which it stands, a bargain. Nothing can be more picturesque or solitary. It stands on a slight eminence in a forest. The road, very old and narrow, passes in front of its drawbridge, never raised in my time, and its moat, stocked with perch and sailed over by many swans, and floating on its surface white fleets of water lilies. Over all this, the schloss shows its many-windowed front, its towers, and its Gothic chapel. The forest opens in an irregular and very picturesque glade before its gate, and at the right a steep Gothic bridge carries the road over a stream that winds in deep shadow through the wood. I have said that this is a very lonely place. Judge whether I say truth. Looking from the hall door towards the road, the forest in which our castle stands extends 15 miles to the right and 12 to the left. The nearest inhabited village is about 7 of your English miles to the left. The nearest inhabited schloss of any historic associations is that of old General Spielsdorf, nearly 20 miles away to the right. I have said the nearest inhabited village because there is only 3 miles westward, that is to say in the direction of General Spielsdorf's schloss, a ruined village with its quaint little church now roofless, in the aisle of which are the moldering tombs of the proud family of Karnstein, now extinct, who once owned the equally desolate chateau which, in the thick of the forest, overlooks the silent ruins of the town. Respecting the cause of the desertion of this striking and melancholy spot, there is a legend which I shall relate to you another time. I must tell you now how very small is the party who constitute the inhabitants of our castle. I don't include servants, or those dependents who occupy rooms in the buildings attached to the Schloss. Listen and wonder. My father, who is the kindest man on earth, but growing old, and I, at the date of my story, only 19. 8 years have passed since then. I and my father constituted the family at the Schloss. My mother, a Styrian lady, died in my infancy, but I had a good-natured governess who had been with me from, I might almost say, my infancy. I could not remember the time when her fat, benignant face was not a familiar picture in my memory. This was Madame Perrodon, a native of Berne, whose care and good nature now in part supplied to me the loss of my mother, whom I do not even remember, so early I lost her. She made a third at our little dinner party. There was a fourth, Mademoiselle de La Fontaine, a lady such as you term, I believe, a finishing governess. She spoke French and German, Madame Perrodon French and broken English, to which my father and I added English, which, partly to prevent its becoming a lost language among us, and partly from patriotic motives, we spoke every day. The consequence was a babble, at which strangers used to laugh, and which I shall make no attempt to reproduce in this narrative. And there were 2 or 3 young lady friends besides, pretty nearly of my own age, who were occasional visitors for longer or shorter terms, and these visits I sometimes returned. These were our regular social resources, but of course there were chance visits from neighbors of only 5 or 6 leagues distance. My life was, notwithstanding, rather a solitary one, I can assure you. My gouvernante had just so much control over me as you might conjecture such sage persons would have in the case of a rather spoiled girl, whose only parent allowed her pretty nearly her own way in everything. The first occurrence in my existence, which produced a terrible impression upon my mind, which, in fact, never has been effaced, was one of the very earliest incidents of my life which I can recollect. Some people will think it so trifling that it should not be recorded here. You will see, however, by and by, why I mention it. The nursery, as it was called, though I had it all to myself, was a large room in the upper story of the castle, with a steep oak roof. I can't have been more than 6 years old, when one night I awoke, and looking round the room from my bed, failed to see the nursery maid. Neither was my nurse there, and I thought myself alone. I was not frightened, for I was one of those happy children who are studiously kept in ignorance of ghost stories, of fairy tales, and of all such lore as makes us cover up our heads when the door cracks suddenly, or the flicker of an expiring candle makes the shadow of a bedpost dance upon the wall nearer to our faces. I was vexed and insulted at finding myself, as I conceived, neglected, and I began to whimper, preparatory to a hearty bout of roaring, when to my surprise I saw a solemn but very pretty face looking at me from the side of the bed. It was that of a young lady who was kneeling, with her hands under the coverlet. I looked at her with a kind of pleased wonder, and ceased whimpering. She caressed me with her hands, and lay down beside me on the bed, and drew me towards her, smiling. I felt immediately delightfully soothed, and fell asleep again. I was wakened by a sensation as if 2 needles ran into my breast, very deep at the same moment, and I cried loudly. The lady started back, with her eyes fixed on me, and then slipped down upon the floor, and as I thought, hid herself under the bed. I was now for the first time frightened, and I yelled with all my might and main. Nurse, nursery maid, housekeeper, all came running in, and hearing my story, they made light of it, soothing me all they could meanwhile. But, child as I was, I could perceive that their faces were pale with an unwonted look of anxiety, and I saw them look under the bed, and about the room, and peep under tables and pluck open cupboards. And the housekeeper whispered to the nurse, "Lay your hand along that hollow in the bed. Someone did lie there, so sure as you did not. The place is still warm." I remember the nursery maid petting me, and all 3 examining my chest, where I told them I felt the puncture, and pronouncing that there was no sign visible that any such thing had happened to me. The housekeeper and the 2 other servants who were in charge of the nursery remained sitting up all night, and from that time a servant always sat up in the nursery until I was about 14. I was very nervous for a long time after this. A doctor was called in. He was pallid and elderly. How well I remember his long saturnine face, slightly pitted with smallpox, and his chestnut wig. For a good while, every second day, he came and gave me medicine, which of course I hated. The morning after I saw this apparition, I was in a state of terror and could not bear to be left alone, daylight though it was, for a moment. I remember my father coming up and standing at the bedside and talking cheerfully and asking the nurse a number of questions, and laughing very heartily at one of the answers, and patting me on the shoulder and kissing me and telling me not to be frightened, that it was nothing but a dream and could not hurt me. But I was not comforted, for I knew the visit of the strange woman was not a dream, and I was awfully frightened. I was a little consoled by the nursery maids assuring me that it was she who had come and looked at me, and lain down beside me in the bed, and that I must have been half dreaming not to have known her face. But this, though supported by the nurse, did not quite satisfy me. I remembered, in the course of that day, a venerable old man, in a black cassock, coming into the room with the nurse and housekeeper, and talking a little to them, and very kindly to me. His face was very sweet and gentle, and he told me they were going to pray, and joined my hands together, and desired me to say, softly, while they were praying, "Lord, hear all good prayers for us, for Jesus' sake." I think these were the very words, for I often repeated them to myself, and my nurse used for years to make me say them in my prayers. I remembered so well the thoughtful, sweet face of that white-haired old man in his black cassock as he stood in that rude, lofty brown room with the clumsy furniture of a fashion 300 years old about him, and the scanty light entering its shadowy atmosphere through the small lattice. He kneeled, and the three women with him, and he prayed aloud with an earnest, quavering voice for, what appeared to me, a long time. I forget all my life preceding that event, and for some time after it is all obscure also, but the scenes I have just described stand out vivid as the isolated pictures of the phantasmagoria surrounded by darkness. Now for the literary commentary, or rather analysis, and that is Chapter 1, but what can you take away from it? At first glance, Chapter 1 appears to be little more than an introduction. We meet Laura, learn about her home, her family, and the strange childhood incident that left a permanent mark upon her memory. Yet as with so much Gothic literature, the surface narrative conceals deeper themes already at work beneath the story. The first thing we encounter is isolation. Laura lives in a beautiful castle surrounded by miles of forest. She is comfortable, cared for, and protected, yet she is also profoundly alone. This tension between security and isolation is one of the central themes not only of Gothic literature, but of human life itself. Human beings require connection, belonging, intimacy, and recognition from others. We may possess comfort and safety, yet still experience a hunger for something more. The castle itself can be understood as a symbol of the self. It is surrounded by walls, protected from the outside world, separated from danger, but also separated from possibility. Beyond those walls lies the forest, one of the most enduring symbols in myth and literature. The forest represents the unknown, the unconscious, the unexplored regions of the human mind. It is the place where ordinary rules begin to weaken and where transformation becomes possible. We are also introduced to another important Gothic theme, the return of what has been forgotten. Near Laura's home stand the ruins of Karnstein, abandoned and silent. The family is gone, the village has fallen into decay, and yet the memory remains. Gothic stories repeatedly remind us that the past is never truly dead. Forgotten histories, buried emotions, unresolved conflicts, and neglected aspects of ourselves often return when we least expect them. The ruins stand as a warning that what appears finished may merely be waiting. The most important moment of the chapter, however, occurs in Laura's childhood encounter with the mysterious woman. What makes the scene so fascinating is that Laura's first reaction is not fear. She is comforted, she is soothed, she is drawn toward the stranger. Only afterward does terror emerge. This is a pattern that appears throughout Gothic literature and throughout human psychology. The things that most attract us are not always the things that are safest for us. Mystery creates fascination. The unknown awakens curiosity. The forbidden often becomes desirable precisely because it exists beyond familiar boundaries. Long before we know who Carmilla is, Le Fanu introduces one of the novel's central questions. Why are human beings drawn toward what unsettles them? The chapter also explores the tension between personal experience and rational explanation. Laura knows what she experienced, yet everyone around her attempts to explain it away. Her father, the servants, and the doctor all offer comforting alternatives. The conflict between lived experience and accepted explanation is a recurring theme not only in Gothic fiction, but in the broader human search for meaning. How do we respond when reality appears larger, stranger, or more mysterious than our existing explanations allow? Perhaps most importantly, Chapter 1 introduces a theme that will echo throughout the entire novel: longing. Laura's life contains comfort but also loneliness, protection but also isolation, stability but also absence. Before any vampire appears, before any supernatural mystery unfolds, there is already a void waiting to be filled. This may be the deepest insight of the chapter. The greatest dangers in life rarely enter through strength. They enter through need. Whatever fills an emotional, psychological, or spiritual void gains tremendous influence over us. As we continue through Carmilla, we will encounter vampires, mysteries, and Gothic horrors. But beneath those elements lies something far more human: the search for connection, the attraction of the unknown, the return of the forgotten past, and the complicated relationship between desire and danger. The story has only begun, but the themes that will define it are already standing quietly in the shadows.